Hi, this is Dr. Crone again. Today we're going to talk about the news media. Our focus in this course is on the political importance of the media. Of course, there are other functions of the media, such as entertainment, that aren't necessarily directly related to the political sphere. But we're going to focus on the media's function as a linkage organization in U.S. politics. The media has so much importance, politically speaking, that sometimes folks across history have referred to the media as the fourth branch of government. If you've ever heard anyone refer to the media as the fourth estate, that's actually what it means. Of course, the media is not a formal branch of government like the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches, but it does serve as, in many ways, as an informal fourth branch. This definition comes really from the aspect that the media provide checks over all the other three branches. In other words, the ability to shape the behavior and stop one or the other of those three branches from getting too much power or using power incorrectly. In the United States, the media is free from government regulation of and interference with content. There are regulations that the government is allowed to put onto the media, such as broadcasting licenses, etc., but there is no the government has no ability to regulate the content. In other words, to tell the media what they can and cannot publish. That's because it's protected by the freedom of the press section of the First Amendment. The media, just like interest groups and political parties, acts as a linkage organization, but interest groups and political parties are generally a way of linking citizens to government via the provision for collective action, whereas the media acts more as a funnel of information and an interpreter of information about the government to the citizens. Political media is the primary way, and in fact, really the only way for 99% of us to know what's going on in government and to observe and understand it. We don't have the ability to observe. In fact, no one can observe all of the actions of the US government. It's too big, too large. There's no way we could do that. Even politicians don't always know and understand the entire US government. So the media gives us access to information about that. In the United States, the media is privately owned, meaning that it's not subsidized in any way by tax dollars. The one exception to that is public broadcasting, where radio and television does receive, public broadcasting does receive some of its funds through government funding, but not all of it. And in fact, over the last several decades, the percentage of private money supporting public broadcasting in the United States has grown. Because the majority of media is privately owned, it means that it's motivated by economic profits in a capitalistic system. And therefore, one of the ways that the media functions is by trying to sell the news that the public wants to buy. In other words, the media are our primary way of knowing, understanding, and observing government, but that is all filtered by the profit motive of the owners of the whatever particular media outlet it might be. So whether you watch cable TV news, whether you watch broadcast news, whether you read a newspaper or look at a website on the internet, all of those are privately owned and for the most part for-profit organizations. And so they have to select from an infinite amount of information about government that's available every day. And they select by focusing on things that they think people will really want to know about and therefore will increase their traffic to their site or increase the number of copies they sell or their ratings. So they focus on conflict, controversy, short-term events, and especially the president. The media fulfill four basic political functions, And any particular media, discrete media event, whether that would be a broadcast of a story, or it would be a written story or a web link, all of those serve at least one of these functions if they are going to be considered to be political media. But many of those articles or videos may actually serve more than one of these functions. Very few of them serve all four. The first function is signaling or agenda setting, and that's the power of the media to focus our attention on and to impact what we think is important. So just by publishing a story and featuring it prominently on their website, or in the old-fashioned days on the top of the front page of the paper, that tells us that this is something we ought to pay attention to. They fulfill what's called a common carrier function, which means that they provide a direct way for politicians to speak directly to the American public by filming and carrying live their speeches. So even when a newspaper carries the text of a speech that a candidate or an elected official might give, that is functioning in the common carrier form. They fulfill a watchdog function as well, and watchdog is when the media investigates and uncovers secrets that politicians or branches of government would prefer to keep hidden. This is especially used in uncovering wrongdoing. And then finally, the media can fulfill a partisan or opinion function when they present one particular argument in favor of or against a certain issue, or could be against a candidate. Recently, say in the last 10 to 20 years or so, there's been a lot of changes in the media based on technology that have changed a lot about the environment and the culture surrounding political media. One of those, the most important things that has happened is that cable television has really become an important technology that was not important, say, up till about the end of the 1970s. On cable-based media, we see an increase, and actually also in online media and social media, we see an increase in the level of bias, partisanship, and opinion that is being expressed. So more of the stories fulfill the partisanship or opinion function. We've also seen a decrease in respect for politicians and the political process, and a corresponding increase in irreverence, cynicism, mocking, silliness even, regarding politics. We've also seen, especially in the last 10 years, the development of the bubble effect, meaning that citizens, because of all the many choices there are for media outlets, are tending to use their selective perception and confirmation bias more and more in selecting the media that they consume. And we call this the bubble effect because it's a reinforcing effect where fewer and fewer people are exposed to media that is either neutral or that presents or has a bias in the opposite side of that person's political, partisan, or ideological preferences. It's controversial whether this is cause, effect, or both, but at the same time, we've seen that increase in bias, decrease in respect, and the increasing bubble effect. We've also seen public opinion changing correspondingly at the same time. And we know that today there is increasing disaffection, alienation with politics, and increasing cynicism about politics that at least has happened during about the same 20 years or so that we've seen these other things happening. We don't know whether the trend has caused this increasing cynicism, or whether the cynicism has caused the media changes, or whether it's very complex causation, but we do see that they have happened at the same time. Since we talked a little bit about bias, let's be sure that we understand what bias means and how we can tell whether a piece of journalism that we are consuming in some way is indicative of bias. Media bias can be defined as the bias or perceived bias of journalists and news producers within the mass media. And it is a subtle effect. It has to do with the selection of stories that are reported on and how those stories are covered. This is different from the media using the partisan function of editorializing when there is a specific opinion piece, whether it's a video, commentator, or whether it is an opinion article on a website or on a online newspaper. When it's an editorial, you'll see the journalist specifically saying things like President Trump is not doing a good job, or something similar to that. Of course, we know that these days it's much stronger worded than that. That's editorializing. That's not necessarily a sign of bias. That's a sign of the media being willing to allow that particular editor or journalist to express their view. Bias, which is more subtle, has to do with when a political opinion of a reporter or the entire editorial staff gets involved in which stories are selected and how those stories are covered. So, for example, a conservative-leaning source such as Fox News might choose to really feature a story that reflected President Trump in a positive light, a success that he had had, whereas a left-leaning or more liberal news source might ignore that story, downplay it, or spin it in a different way. In order to put these changes that we've identified into context, it's important to look at what the political impact of the media has been on American politics since the beginning of any kind of a mass media. And in that, we can identify 4 separate sections of history and look at how over time the political nature of the media have changed. This is really an important political science skill in keeping perspective and understanding historical context of what's going on today. Many times students will write to me or discuss in a discussion board post as if the bias that's seen today is something new or something never before encountered. And that's probably because they're only going back in time to that green section of the mid-1900s and not understanding what journalism was like, especially in the 1800s. So let's take a look at these. Early on, newspapers and political media were absolutely explicitly partisan. In fact, many of them took the name of the paper took from a political party's name. Generally, they were owned and operated specifically for the purpose of promoting a party and that party's candidates. And they reported news from Washington, D.C. or from state capitals or towns in a way that specifically painted their preferred party in a positive light and painted the other parties in a negative light. The idea of objective journalism was not expected by these newspaper consumers or their creators. So that's actually, there was actually quite a bit more bias in the early 1800s, really for most of the 1800s in newspapers than there is at all today in any media, except for possibly partisan websites. And what limited the effect of this on politics was that at this point in time, first of all, newspapers were expensive to produce. And so the fee that was charged to purchase a newspaper was high. Parties actually used these as fundraisers, so the price that they charged had to not only cover the cost of production, but also had to cover the donation to the party. And also literacy rates among the American public were much lower than they are today, meaning that these papers were mostly consumed by loyal partisans who were of the upper class, who had the money and the education to be able to read, and to want to read these papers. So their distribution was much lower. We didn't really get mass distribution of newspapers until the late 1800s. Sometime in about the 1880s or so, things started, and certainly took off in the 1890s through the early 1900s. And this was a time when, in the larger economy, fortunes were being made by tycoons, and ambitious Americans were trying to think of new ways and how to harness new technologies in order to make a profit. This was basically capitalism at its most rampant. And some people, including William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, but others as well, figured out a way to leverage the new technology available in printing that made it possible to print papers for much less money, and also take advantage of rising education rates and literacy rates amongst the public. They figured out that you didn't have to have a paper that only promoted a political party, or that only could be read by sort of very highbrow people like the New York Times was at this point. They figured out you could write a paper and sell it for very low prices to an eager, educated but working class public, and that's what they did. And this was the first time that the focus in journalism was the profit motive. These two, Hearst and Pulitzer especially, were rivals in New York, and were trying to outdo each other on who could sell the most papers by making the most outlandish and sensationalistic claims. And the Spanish-American War and troubles in Cuba and disputes between the United States and Spain over who was going to control the Southern Caribbean, essentially, or the Northern Caribbean, I'm sorry. Those kind of things were exploited. Some people say William Randolph Hearst created the Spanish-American War. I don't think he created it, but he certainly took advantage of it and sensationalized it so that Americans were probably more excited about what was going on there than they certainly would have been otherwise. So all of those things proved that you could make money in journalism especially by sensationalizing and grabbing readers' attention in modern times and social media, we could call these clickbait, only it was not, instead of clickbait, it was bait for the worker walking home in New York City, walking home from a factory job, who had an extra penny in his pocket to buy a newspaper because of the interesting picture or headline. Yellow journalism, which is what this is called, still lives on today, and most especially in tabloids that are direct descendants of those original New York papers, such as the New York Post and the New York Daily News. And we see these, if you've ever been to New York and gone past a newsstand, you'll see these very, very salacious headlines and sensationalistic pictures, and that try to pull in somebody who'd be willing to spend money on the paper. It's a little bit different than what we think of as the supermarket tabloids, where they get by on stories of aliens and things that are obviously untrue. These are a little bit higher brow journalism than that, but they still do use that yellow journalism sensationalism. There was a counter reaction, as with many, many historical trends. There was a counter reaction to this somewhere around the 1910s and 1930s. The New York Times presented a clear alternative to yellow journalism even throughout the period of time. And a group of people who were essentially, who wanted to see more professionalism, more neutrality, more what you would call decorum, and appeal to politeness and a sense of sort of social respectability in journalism, began pushing for more professionalized, more neutral journalism. And this gradually took over journalism, although we still do have tabloids today. By about the mid-1930s or so, you had the development of professional training schools for journalism, such as Columbia, that was very well respected. Today we have vestiges of that, especially at Ohio University in Ohio, with a world-renowned journalism major. professional training, and this is embodied by people like Walter Cronkite. The idea here was that journalists, especially TV journalists, as that developed throughout the 50s, would literally be fair and balanced, not necessarily the meaning of that today in selling Fox News, but that would literally not take any partisan political stands, and therefore would find themselves being trusted by the public. There was still a profit motive, but the motive had changed here into something where being trusted, being well educated, being someone who didn't take sides as a news person or as a news organization would result in higher sales. If you want to see more of what that looked like, you can go ahead and use this link. If the link doesn't work, you can watch, or you can just Google Walter Cronkite, Martin Luther King assassination, and you'll find a good example of a clip that embodies that trusted objective. And there's still much of the objective, trusted ethic amongst newspapers and even broadcast news today, especially the Wall Street Journal. I have that on here as an example. You're not going to see headlines like "Pea Brain" on the, in the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times generally adheres to that as well. Doesn't mean they don't have a political stake, but it does mean that they value objectivity and a calmer, sort of more educated, polite way of presenting the news. Despite the fact that a lot of objectivity and that ethic continues in some areas of the news today, since the 1990s, we've seen different changes, though. And a lot of what we've seen is an increase in bias and irreverence that goes along with the change from cable news to and also the development of internet news sites. Why have things returned to a more biased state in today's media? A lot of it has to do with technology, as is often the case. The development of cable technology meant that it was for the first time possible for anybody who wanted and had the money to produce a broadcast channel, a TV channel, could do so. Prior to that, broadcast TV had to be limited and regulated by the government and licensed by the government because it was a limited quantity. There's only so much broadcast air with bandwidth available. But cable brought about the unlimited channels. And unlimited channels meant the government no longer felt an important stake in making sure that those who were licensed to produce the news took their job of being fair seriously. So in the 1980s, the Federal Communications Commission decided they no longer needed to police sort of whether broadcasters were, quote, being fair and covering all the sides, because they thought that a side could easily be covered by someone starting a new channel. That technology, combined with something else that happened in the 1990s, was the rise of conservative talk radio. Conservative talk radios, that Rush Limbaugh is the biggest example of this, proved that there was a reliable and fairly well-off audience who could support broadcast of one particular biased perspective. And so those the loyal listeners engendered by conservative talk radio led clever entrepreneurs to decide to use that to appeal to that same audience using cable technology, and hence that was the creation of Fox News. It was a 24-hour news channel. Now, there were 24-hour news channels before this. CNN had been operating before this for a good 5 years or so before Fox News. But CNN at the time stuck to the old Walter Cronkite model of being objective and nonpartisan and trying to appeal to a very general audience by its objectivity. Whereas Fox News specifically tried to reach out with a clear conservative bias to the conservative talk radio audience and an expanded audience using cable technology. And certainly Rupert Murdoch, the creator of Fox News, got very, very rich and was an extremely clever and creative entrepreneur in creating that. The success of Fox led to, as other entrepreneurs looked at that and sort of were jealous of the success that had been had by Fox News and how much money they were making. The fact that it had a huge audience and a huge profit led other entrepreneurs to commercial interests, and using the competition drive, said, hey, maybe there's a liberal audience out there as well. And that led to the development of MSNBC and the sort of politicization of both MSNBC and CNN, 24-hour competitors, but with a clear liberal bias. And that's kind of where we stand today. Irreverence also rose during this time, partly because cable technology allowed that unlimited number of channels, allowed for specialized channels to make money with a target audience, a narrower audience than you needed for a broadcast network. And so some of those audiences who might be interested in consuming quote unquote news also required entertainment and weren't interested in straight up news channels. And so some of those cable channels, such as Comedy Central, decided to create comedy news sources to mostly as entertainment and sort of tongue-in-cheek. Now, this was not a brand new idea. In fact, in the 1970s, Saturday Night Live really debuted this idea with having their Weekend Update feature, which they still have today. But it was when Jon Stewart took over The Daily Show, and then hence many competitors arose from that, and collaborators arose from that. There seems to be somewhat of a liberal bias in most of these comedy news sources. And by 2015, 12% of people in a survey said that they used The Daily Show as an important source of political news. Jon Stewart was reportedly shocked by this and somewhat appalled and said, oh my gosh, we never meant to be people's most important source of political news. And again, that audience tends to be younger. However, that sort of idea that we could be satirical and funny and commercially successful has led many other media outlets to kind of play along into that rise of irreverence, because now viewers seem to expect some level of that as part of the news, whereas back in Walter Cronkite's day, that was not an expectation of audiences at all. Of course, another thing we've seen a rise in over the year, in the last few years, is what we call fake news. Fake news, the true definition of fake news. Now, sometimes politicians use this just to try to discredit anything that they don't agree with or that paints them in a negative light, but that's not the definition of fake news. The true definition of fake news is a news article or something that looks like a news article that is deliberately created to spread hoaxes or other kinds of false information. It is written and published specifically with the intent to mislead, usually for a political motive, but also often a profit motive as well. And therefore, it's different than satire, such as Comedy Central, or obvious parody, such as The Onion, which is a website that's existed for a really long time. It used to be a newspaper. It's deliberately misinformation, but it's not trying to mislead. So it has to be deliberately wrong and published specifically to try to mislead people for some kind of political motive in order to really be considered fake news. A misconception is this is new. It's not. It's been going on for a really long time. Let's look at how it started a little bit, just a couple examples before we turn to why it's become more widespread and politically damaging in the last 5 years or so. So it probably goes way back before this, but I was able to find an example from 1475 of a Catholic priest who was later turned into a saint by the Catholic Church, who made a false claim that Jews had murdered a child and drank the child's blood for Passover. And the mayor of the town in Italy took this seriously and ordered the arrest, torture, and death of 15 innocent people. That has pretty bad consequences. So we know that fake news existed even in medieval times. Um, the Hearst papers, the yellow journalists, were certainly not above fake news. And they published stories that they knew were fake with the intent to sell papers and sensationalize war, the prospect for war. And this is an example of sensationalizing things that never happened, which were strip searches of women by women traveling on American boats in the Caribbean by Spanish sailors or military personnel. This was made up. And that's just one of many examples at the time. Today, too many examples to talk about all of them, but here's one example about an example from something, and you can see today that the impact of these is that they look like a true news website or somewhere where you could go. So a person could land on this page and say, well, that looks like on the face of it, it looks like an OK News report to me. Why do we have so much more of this now? It's really a combination, again, of technological ability. The fact that we have the ability to create articles online that are hyperlinked, it has really changed the game in all kinds of media distribution. That and the fact that these articles, because they're sensational sounding, they're the kind of thing that makes people want to read them. And then once they've read them, they're so sensational that if someone believes them, they want to share them. Maybe they even want to share them if they don't believe them. And what that's led to, the hyperlink technology, which might be surprising to you, has not only existed for maybe 20 years or so, a little bit longer than 20 years, but not too much more. And the rise of social media and the ability of people to distribute something that they've read to lots and lots of other people has led to almost unlimited distribution of this stuff. Whereas in the past, you had to buy a paper and maybe show it to someone physically. Today, it goes viral extremely quickly. If you're interested in knowing how to avoid fake news or detect it for yourself, I like this link. It's a really good one. Okay, so let's wrap this up by talking a little bit about what effect the media has on citizens. I think that people outside of political science often exaggerate the effect medias can have. But they also can be guilty sometimes of downplaying the effects that the media has or ignoring certain effects that we know the media has. So let's look at the exaggeration first. Do the media tell us what to think? Are we really just sheep who are following what our favorite commentator says? And confirmation bias that we've already spoken about in the previous chapters on public opinion and participation. Confirmation bias turns out to be a major limit on the influence of the ability of political news to shape us and change our behavior or the way we think. Confirmation bias, again, remember, is that tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that goes along with your pre-existing beliefs. And so that means that the ability of the media to present something that would make us all change our beliefs is very, very unlikely, because we tend to take our beliefs and use those to shape the kind of information we seek out and pay attention to. However, the media does have some real effects on people, and these are often overlooked by ordinary members of the public. These are the agenda setting effect and the framing effect. The agenda-setting effect shows us that the media doesn't necessarily tell us what to think because of our confirmation bias, but it does tell us what to think or talk about. And this can be seen over and over again by, if you look at polls, allowing people to name a particular issue that they think is the most important problem facing the world today or the United States today, we can totally link naming that issue with that issue having been in the news. So for example, there was a spike in 2014 of people saying immigration was the most important issue around the same time that we had the first iteration of what to do with children who were detained with their families or by themselves trying to sneak into the United States. Undocumented children in the United States was a huge issue back in 2014. If you don't believe me, go ahead and look that up. Of course, that continues to be big today. The fact that this was in the news didn't mean that it was a more important problem. In fact, the problem had been going on for a very long time. It's just that the media started focusing on a particular way that the government was responding to that. And for a short amount of time, it made people more likely to think and talk about immigration. So that's the agenda setting effect. The framing effect of the media is even more subtle, and it affects all of us. I challenge you to think about how this affects you. Because the media are for profit, we talked about this at the very beginning, they focus on the kinds of things that sell papers or sell clickbait. So they tend to write stories that focus on conflict, like conflict between parties or between the president and Congress or between two members of the executive branch. They focus on sensational stories like strippers. They focus on candidates because we all want to know about the inner lives of candidates. They focus on the president because we're more interested in that. It's easier to sell it as an interesting story to focus on the president rather than Congress, which is hard to kind of get a handle on. They focus on short-term, discrete events like a school shooting. And they focus on what's negative because negative sells. Nobody buys a paper. Everyone always says they want to see positive stories in a paper, but very few people click on or would buy stories that are simply telling good news. That means there's less coverage of long-term issues and trends. So for example, we may not hear context and not hear historical details that would make it, that would put issues into a different light. We don't generally do that because the media are generally on to the next big thing. We don't hear as much about Congress. When we do, it's about congressional conflict. It's almost never about places where members of Congress are compromising and working together and hammering out plans. There's not much coverage at all of the courts except for very big or very sensational cases. There's very little coverage of, like you said, good news of cooperation and conflict resolution, and very little coverage of positive news. This frames the way we think about things, and the media can encourage us to think of things in a certain way. So for example, I picked two examples that the media focus on, and we'll look at how they tell these stories. Let's say there's a mass shooting. Generally speaking, if the shooter was a native of the United States or a fairly long-term citizen of the United States, maybe having been here and emigrated here as a child or something, so they're sort of it's obvious that they're American, then often the stories get focused as the conflict between NRA supporters and gun control advocates. Sometimes the focus will also be on violence in media, such as video games or movies, and how that has impacted the shooter. Sometimes, if it's a teenager, often the stories will focus on bullying and whether the shooter was bullied, which kind of leaves out a lot of other possible things to talk about when there's a mass shooting. However, if there's a mass shooting by an immigrant who is a Muslim, then the story will be framed around terrorism and immigration law. And very little of the NRA versus gun control or violence in the media will be talked about if it happens to be a Muslim immigrant. Looking at debates, that's where framing also really comes into play. There's almost all media tries to focus on who won or lost a certain debate, on quotable moments, playing over and over again that one pithy zinger that one or the other candidate got in, or weak candidate moments where the candidate looked baffled or seemed confused. All of those are probably not in any way the point of a debate, which is to air policy differences and try to understand the candidates' differing positions on issues. That kind of usually gets lost in media coverage of a debate. We think that the results of these issues of framing and sensationalism and agenda setting have helped result in increases in public cynicism, public alienation, disaffection with politics in general, and negativity. That's all I've got for today. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope it's been helpful to you to help you understand what's in the textbook. Feel free to email me with any questions, and I hope you have a great day.